Communication helps us develop and sustain feelings of closeness in various types of relationships. The ways that we communicate closeness might differ depending on the type of relationship. For example, you may communicate closeness differently to your parents compared to your friends, compared to your romantic partners. So, in this unit, we will talk pretty generally about how we communicate closeness and support across a variety of relationship types. And this information overlaps with Chapter 7 in your textbook. There are three main types of closeness in relationships, and each one highlights a different aspect of closeness. So, those three types are physical, emotional, and relational closeness. So, we'll start with physical closeness, which reflects the amount of proximity and contact between two people. So, proximity, if you recall from Unit 1, reflects things like closeness and distance and the use of space, right? And so, the closer you are to someone, the more likely you are going to allow them within your physical space, within your personal space. So, physical closeness includes things like touching, sitting next to each other, spending time together, particularly quality alone time together, and having sex. So, affectionate communication kind of characterizes physical closeness. If we were speaking about this in person, I would ask you all to let me know if you think this statement is true or false. So, affectionate communication is more central to closeness than sex in marital relationships. So, you can think about this on your own, but I will, go ahead and tell you that this statement is in fact true. So, affectionate communication is actually more central to closeness than sexual interactions in marital relationships specifically. But of course, this may differ in other types of relationships, right? So, like in an early dating relationship, sex may be more central to closeness. Or in a friends with benefits relationship, which we talked about with relationship maintenance, one partner may prioritize sort of the emotional aspect of that relationship while the other prioritizes the sexual contact. So, this may differ depending on the type of relationship. And in the next unit on love and attachment, we will actually talk about passion as being kind of an interesting variable that might influence this relationship as well. So stay tuned for that. In addition to physical closeness, we can also communicate closeness emotionally. So, emotional closeness is really reflected in sharing and caring, right? So, having a sense of shared experiences, trust, enjoyment, concern, caring, those types of things. So, on the sharing side, this includes things like sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences, and sharing your feelings with another person. In other words, this is reflected in self disclosure, which we talked about a few units ago. And then on the caring side, this includes showing concern for another person and providing support. So, my question for you now is which relationships do you think are characterized by high levels of self disclosure and social support? The research suggests that of these three romantic partners, close friendships, and parents and adult children, it's close friendships that are characterized by the highest levels of self-disclosure and social support, right? So, and this kind of makes sense because it's through disclosure that you get to know somebody, that you get to learn your likes and dislikes and the likes and dislikes of the other person, right? It helps you to identify things that you have in common and to determine your similarity. And in many cases, I think many of us probably can agree with the fact that our best friends may know us better than our parents, and in some cases, even our romantic partners, right? So these are the people, your close friendships are often the people that you rely on in times of distress. And then finally, we have relational closeness in relationships. So, relational closeness reflects that idea of interdependence that we talked about way back in Unit 1, right? So, this involves relying on each other. And in this case, your needs and what matters to you and the other person overlap, right? So in other words, what matters to you also matters to me. So, relational closeness is expressed through making major life decisions together, becoming emotionally invested in your family, maybe exchanging resources, and influencing each other's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, right? So, you're just generally meeting each other's needs. And so, all of these things are rooted in behavioral patterns that foster interdependence or interconnectedness. And relational closeness is specifically associated with things like caregiving and social support. Now, all three of these types of closeness overlap, right? So you can be emotionally close and physically close to someone and also share a high degree of interdependence. But they have distinct qualities. So, for example, you can be emotionally close, but not physically close to someone, right? So, being close to another person doesn't mean that you always have to be together in the same physical space. You can express closeness, emotionally and relationally. For example, long distance relationships or people in long distance relationships we know have to express closeness in other ways, right? So they rely primarily on mediated channels to communicate with one another. And so the aspect of the relationship, the type of relationship, might influence the ways in which um, you communicate closeness to other people. But we communicate closeness generally through by engaging in three different types of behaviors. The first is affection, the second is immediacy, and the third is social support. And we will talk about each of those in turn. So I'll start here with affection. Affection is generally defined as an internal state of fondness and intense positive feelings toward another living being, which means that affection is not exclusive to people. Because we certainly show affection to our pets as well. I think I've mentioned before, I have a dog, and I hug and kiss my dog all the time, right? And I show him all kinds of physical and emotional affection. And that's an important aspect of affection is that it is both an emotion in that it reflects these positive feelings, and it's a need, which we will discuss here in just one second. But expressing affection or not expressing affection is a relationship maintenance behavior, right? It allows you to maintain the relationship, or maybe by not expressing affection, keep it in the state that you prefer. So if you don't want to become more intimate with someone, maybe you kind of reduce the level of affection that you communicate to the other person. But we use affection to show people that we care about them. We behave in ways that are affectionate toward them. But again, you can avoid being too affectionate with someone that you don't want to develop a close relationship with. And we also know that people give and receive affection in ways that are adaptive or evolutionarily advantageous for their relationships. And this makes sense because showing affection allows you to present yourself as a viable mate or partner or a viable parent for any future children that you may have. And that brings us to affection exchange theory, which I will be abbreviating from here on out as AET. Before I really get into the theory, it's important to note that affection exchange theory is a biosocial theory. So that means that it reflects the integration of both biological and social factors that influence communication. So this kind of comes out of evolutionary theory. So evolution, we know, describes how inherited traits change over time, right? So we're focusing on genetic traits that promote survival and reproduction and how they get passed on from generation to generation, while those traits that are not advantageous for survival and reproduction do not get passed down from generation to generation. Now, I have to underscore this and I need you to remember it. There are two important limitations of evolutionary theory. So the first is the assumption that there are natural innate differences between men and women. And that can lead to stereotyped predictions as well as interpretations of research findings, right? So evolutionary theory assumes that men and women are different and those differences are natural, not socialized. And we know from other perspectives of communication that a lot of the differences between men and women are, in fact, due to socialization. So keep that in mind. And then the second important limitation of evolutionary theories is that they don't acknowledge culture or individual differences in understanding human behavior. So, for example, in some cultures, it's just generally more common to show affection than in other cultures, right? And there are also some people, in terms of like individual differences, who just feel more comfortable expressing and receiving affection. So keep this in mind now as we discuss affection exchange theory, but also later when we get to attachment theory, which is another biosocial theory. So there are three primary assumptions of affection exchange theory. The first is that procreation and survival are superordinate human goals. So, in other words, um, we are our goal, our overarching goal, is to produce offspring and continue our genetic line. So that's one of the assumptions of affection exchange theory. The second is that communication can serve one or both of these goals. And the third assumption is that individuals do not need to be aware of the evolutionary goals that their behaviors serve, right? We don't typically think about the way that we communicate and the way that we behave in terms of, will this allow me to continue my genetic line? Like, that's usually not a thought that we have. So these assumptions will, I think, become clearer as I go through the 5 primary propositions of the theory, which I'm going to do on the next couple of slides here. As I mentioned before, there are 5 propositions of affection exchange theory. And the first is that humans are born with the ability to feel affection and the need to feel affection. And there are 2 important implications of this proposition. The first is that the ability to experience and to feel affection is innate. It is not learned, right? So in other words, your parents and your teachers and other people in your lives did not teach you how to show affection or that you need affection. That is something that comes naturally to you. And the second important implication here is that affection is a fundamental need, and that means that there are benefits when the need is fulfilled, and there are consequences when the need is not fulfilled. So I always think about like when I'm sick, or maybe just generally having a bad day or a rough week, right? These are times where you might need more affection than in other times. And when you don't get it, that experience is stressful, right? So I mentioned when I'm sick, I do pretty much anything I can do to prevent spreading my germs to other people in my house. And this was true pre-pandemic, right? Because I I always, am kind of irritated when I pick something up from somebody else. When I wish that they would have just said, like, I'm sick, we probably shouldn't hang out, right? So I try to kind of isolate myself from other people in my home, and in doing so, though, right, I start to feel bad, not necessarily like bad about myself, but bad because I'm not getting those needs for affection and closeness met, right? So when you're sick and isolating, you almost crave that human contact, right? Which I think could explain some of the mental health issues that people experienced at the height of the pandemic, when we were all isolating, right? When courses were online and people were pretty much only working from home, missing that human contact, right, it was stressful, and it negatively impacted a number of people physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and so on. So that might be explained by affection exchange theory. The second proposition is that feelings of affection and expressions of affection are distinct, and they do not necessarily occur simultaneously, which means that we can feel affection without expressing it, and we can show affection then without feeling it, right? So for example, you might be afraid to express affection that you feel when you fear rejection from the other person, or if the context is particularly restricting, or restricting you from expressing that felt affection. So, for example, if you work with your romantic partner, it might be inappropriate to express affection in the workplace, right? But you feel that affection, but you're just not going to outwardly show it to the other person. On the other hand, you might express affection that you don't feel, perhaps when you're trying to manipulate someone, or when you're just being polite. So, in terms of like manipulation, if any of you have seen the movie Frozen, um, we early on in the movie, Anna meets Hans and she thinks they sort of fall in love. And then as the plot unfolds, we find out that he's been so, outwardly affectionate toward her, because he was trying to manipulate her, um, and get to her sister Elsa to kind of take over the kingdom or whatnot, right? So you could express affection when you don't feel it if you're trying to manipulate someone, but also sometimes we just do it out of politeness. I have a friend who is a big hugger, and I'm just not that type of person. Um, but I'm not going to, when I see him, right, when I greet him, if he comes to give me a hug, I'm not going to be like, ew, no. I just go along with it, right? And he usually hugs upon greeting and also upon exiting. So it's like two hugs in the same setting, which can be overwhelming for some people. So, but I just do it to kind of go along to get along. There's also an entire line of research focusing on deceptive affectionate messages, right? So, again, expressing that affection when you don't really feel it. If you're interested, I'm happy to send some articles your way if you want to do some additional reading. Okay, proposition number 3 is that affectionate communication is adaptive, meaning that sending and receiving affection contributes to those superordinate goals of survival and reproductive success. And there are two causal pathways through which affection contributes to survival and procreation. The first is that affectionate behavior promotes relationship development and maintenance. So, relationships increase access to material resources like food and shelter, but also emotional resources like support, both of which increase your likelihood of survival. And then, secondly, showing affection communicates your viability as a partner and as a parent, right? So, showing affection to your romantic partner shows emotional capacity and commitment to the relationship and to the family. So, think of affection as sort of your outward display of investment in the relationship and the family unit. So, survival and procreation are fundamental needs, and so our bodies respond accordingly in positive relationships. So, again, giving and receiving affection feels good, and the lack of affection is aversive, it's stressful. And the final two propositions of affection exchange theory reflect the idea that not all affectionate behavior enhances survival and procreation. So, Proposition 4 says that humans vary in their optimal tolerances for affection, right? So, not everybody has a high tolerance for affection, right? It's variable across individuals, and there's only so much that each person can take or prefers. And then Proposition 5 is that affectionate behaviors that violate the optimal tolerance are physiologically aversive, right? Physiologically, so your body reacts to that state, kind of involuntarily. So essentially, what these two propositions are saying is that affectionate communication in the wrong relationships or in the wrong contexts can inhibit motivations for survival and procreation. So, if a stranger touches you, it might feel weird, right? And that automatic, like, cringy feeling um, cues you in, it triggers you to kind of pay attention to that, right? And you realize that that's an aversive state. You don't like this feeling. It creates stress and anxiety, and it violates social norms, right? So, the last two propositions kind of capture the idea that um, there are some situations where affectionate communication does not enhance or promote survival and procreation. So we've been talking a lot about affectionate communication, so it's probably a good idea to define it. So affectionate communication is any behavior that communicates feelings of fondness or intense positive regard to another person, but is also interpreted by the other person as doing so, right? So the ways in which we display affection, we know, are constrained by cultural and contextual norms of appropriateness. So again, you may not kiss someone in the workplace, even if they are your romantic partner, but you can still communicate affection through a more appropriate behavior like a smile or a touch on the arm. To help explain what qualifies as affectionate communication, consider this three-part model, right? Each of these behaviors differs in how they are both encoded and decoded. So, verbal communication involves written or spoken expressions of affection, right? So, saying, I love you, saying, I care about you. And we usually send these with the intent of communicating affection, and they are usually understood as affectionate communication. This would also include things like self disclosure, direct emotional expressions. So, again, I love you, or maybe in terms of like friendships, you're a really fun person to be around. Um, it also includes compliments and praises and assurances, right? So, commitment statements about commitment to the relationship. I want to see you again. I can't imagine my life without you, and so on. Direct nonverbal communication are non linguistic behaviors that show affection within a specific relationship or a speech community. So in the United States, we tend to show affection nonverbally by hugging and kissing and holding hands and those types of things. Um, so these usually have a consensual meaning within a given culture. So they are generally encoded and decoded intentionally, right? So a smile signals positivity, a hug shows warmth. And then we have indirect nonverbal communication. And this is showing affection through social or material support. So things like helping somebody out with a task, right? So helping your friend move, giving them a ride to the airport if they need one, lending somebody money. Oftentimes in the United States and in other cultures, when someone passes away, friends and family will bring food, right, to the family, um, so that they don't have to worry about feeding and taking care of themselves in that regard. They have sort of the support from others as they navigate that difficult time. So those are the three types of affectionate behavior according to this particular model. When testing affection exchange theory, researchers primarily focus on one of two primary propositions. The first is that if affection promotes survival, then some relationships will be characterized by more affection than others. Right? So your family relationships and your romantic relationships promote survival, so those are going to be the ones that will, theoretically, be characterized by more affection, right? So recall that reproductive success depends on the ability to procreate, as well as ensure that genes are passed on to future generations. So in terms of romantic relationships, affection shows investment in the relationship, which promotes bonding, trust, and commitment. So this means that you would be more affectionate with a longer term partner than with a one night stand or with a casual sexual partner, because you're more likely to reproduce with someone that you are committed to, according to this theory. We can achieve reproductive success by having children of our own, but also by protecting others who carry our genes. So, we are also more likely to show affection to those who share more genetic material within our families. So, children share more genes with parents than with grandparents, for example, and siblings share more genes with one another than with their cousins. So those are the relationships that are going to be characterized by higher levels of affection according to this theory. And then the second proposition that's typically examined when testing this theory is the idea that giving and receiving affection promotes physical and mental health and well-being. So in other words, showing affection tends to act as a stress buffer, alleviating the effects of stress and improving our ability to recover from stressful events when they occur. Kissing, in particular, is a very common way of communicating affection non-verbally, and that's true across different cultures. So on Husky CT, I've provided a study that actually uses affection exchange theory, tests affection exchange theory in the context of kissing. You are welcome to review this study if you're interested, but I'm going to cover the highlights of the study here. But I wanted to give you an example of how we might use this theory to understand affectionate communication in certain types of relationships. So let's start by looking at the different implications of kissing from three different perspectives. In terms of the biological perspective or at the biological level, kissing is a form of touch that involves direct contact of the lips to various parts of the other person's body, right? Whether that's the other person's lips, parts of their face, their hair, hand, and so on. Romantic kissing specifically typically involves contact of both partners' lips, which is significant from a biological perspective because the lips are highly sensitive to touch. So, prolonged mutual kissing then stimulates a really strong sensation compared to touch on other parts of the body. And kissing also tends to promote other forms of touching, like hugging and hand holding and so forth. Usually, I mean, not always, but usually you don't just kiss somebody. Usually there's another form of touch involved there as well. At the physiological level, there really isn't much research on the physiological components of kissing, but we can make some guesses based on what we know about physical displays of affection more generally. So, in romantic relationships, affection tends to lower stress responses, and that includes blood pressure and cortisol, right? So, it physiologically decreases blood pressure and levels of the stress hormone cortisol. And then from an emotional perspective or at the emotional level, kissing tends to promote feelings of positivity when it occurs in the context of a positive, affectionate relationship. So the driving hypothesis in this particular study that I'm going to explain is that kissing may be a predictor of key health outcomes. And I will now explain why. To test their hypotheses, the researchers from this particular study recruited 52 adults who were married or living with a romantic partner. And the participants completed a questionnaire before coming to the lab. And then when they were in the lab, they had a small amount of blood drawn, which allowed the researchers to examine some of those physiological markers like the stress hormone level and cholesterol level. Once they did that, um, they had one group of participants that they identified as the experimental group. And those participants in the experimental group were instructed to kiss their romantic partner more frequently and for longer periods of time than they normally do. The other group was the control group, and those people were not given these instructions, right? And so in creating these two groups, the experimental and the control group, this allowed the researchers to examine differences between those two groups in terms of levels of cholesterol, levels of stress, depression, and relationship satisfaction over a 6-week period, right? So at both time 1 and at time 2, which occurred 6 weeks later, participants completed measures of stress, depression, and relationship satisfaction. And at both times, blood was drawn to examine cholesterol levels. So, what did the researchers find? Well, they found that the couples who kissed more actually showed a decrease in cholesterol levels, as well as a decrease in stress levels. And they showed a significant increase in relationship satisfaction. Compared to the participants in the control group who were not instructed to engage in kissing for longer periods of time and more often. So, what does this mean? What are the implications? Why are these findings important? Well, they're important for a few reasons. The first is that communicating affection can be used potentially as an intervention technique to combat heart disease, right? Because increased levels of kissing lowered those cholesterol levels and lowered those stress levels. So we might be able to use research from interpersonal communication to actually combat some of our serious health issues. And secondly, in this particular study, kissing led to a decrease in stress as well as an increase in relationship satisfaction. And this is important because many people assume that the causal link goes only one way, right? We tend to assume that low stress and high relationship satisfaction leads to more affection. But this study suggests that the opposite is true as well, in that affection might reduce stress and improve relationship satisfaction, which is really interesting and important for romantic couples and even maybe for family relationships as well. So again, if you want to take a look at that study and read it in full detail, it is available for you on Husky CT. But now I'm going to transition from affection to immediacy. And this is the second way that we tend to communicate support to other people or closeness to other people. So immediacy is a broader concept than affection. So that's the difference between the two. Immediacy communicates warmth and availability. It decreases perceived psychological distance or physical distance, and it promotes involvement between people. So immediacy is often described as, generally speaking, as positive involvement behaviors. So things like making eye contact, smiling, shaking hands, right? Those are things that don't necessarily equate to affection, but they do show positive feelings and high levels of involvement in an interaction. So affection is really rooted in feelings of positive regard toward a specific person, and it develops over time. But immediacy behaviors can be used across a variety of interactions to express positivity and involvement in the interaction, but not necessarily affection. And there are different types of immediacy. So verbal immediacy includes things like word choice, forms of address, depth of disclosure, and relationship indicators. So in terms of word choice, this would be things that communicate interdependence. So using inclusive pronouns. So making statements about we or us versus I, you, or me, right? So word choice is important there. Different forms of address reflect the closeness of a relationship. And when we are closer to someone, we tend to use more casual forms of address. So that might be nicknames or pet names, but it might also be things like titles that you use as forms of address that indicate respect or like closeness or distance. So for example, if you call your professors, your instructors, Professor so-and-so or Dr. so-and-so, right? Your relationship may not necessarily be that close, but if your professor says to you, hey, you know what, just call me Sarah, then that does indicate a level of closeness within that relationship. So less formal forms of address when the relationship is closer. Depth of disclosure, right? We know that as we get to know somebody and we develop more intimate feelings for them, our disclosure becomes less superficial. And then relationship indicators include how you refer to each other, right? So saying this is my best friend instead of my friend, or this is my girlfriend, right, instead of my friend, things like that. Or referring to your roommate as your friend rather than just your roommate, right? So the way you refer to one another in interactions. And then we also have nonverbal immediacy. And you can communicate immediacy nonverbally in different ways, but the big three are space, touch, and eye behaviors. So these three nonverbal channels tend to communicate closeness and intimacy to another person, or on the flip side, a lack of closeness with another person. So when you are feeling close to somebody, you tend to let them into your personal space. You engage in various forms of affectionate touch and mutual eye contact. And I could go into much more detail about these types of behaviors, but to save us some time, I won't. But if you have questions or you'd like to um, learn more information about how these three specifically communicate immediacy, feel free to let me know. All right, so my discussion on immediacy was very short compared to my discussion about affection. And similarly, my discussion about supportive communication will be a little bit shorter as well. But supportive communication is the third way that we communicate affection in our close relationships. And this just generally refers to the verbal and the nonverbal behaviors that communicate that you're there for another person, right? So these are intended to provide assistance to others that you perceive as needing that assistance or that aid. And there, again, are different kind of categories or forms of supportive communication. So we have emotional support, which includes showing the other person that you care about them, showing the other person that you are concerned about their well being, and showing the other person that you can empathize with them or understand where they're coming from, or you can kind of put yourself in their shoes, right? And engage in perspective taking. Esteem support are behaviors that communicate to the other person that they are valued, that they are capable, and in many cases that they are admired, right? So you're boosting someone's self-worth when using esteem support. Informational support includes giving advice or information to solve a problem. And so this could be providing them with facts and information that just might help them to engage in the problem solving process more effectively. Sometimes we just don't have information and maybe another person does. And so they can help us in that regard. Tangible aid reflects physical assistance, goods, and services. So again, helping somebody move or babysitting for them, right? Watching their kids if they have some kind of like important meeting they have to go to, or even if they, if it's a couple and they just haven't been on a date in a long time, maybe you offer to watch their kids so that they can get some alone time with each other. And then finally, we have network support. So this is where you kind of direct somebody to another person or a group that can maybe help them more effectively than you can, or that are more equipped, better equipped to help the other person, right? So I do this all the time with students. If they come to me with a problem, a personal problem, or they're struggling, I will, of course, try my best to offer them support myself, but then I also kind of recommend that they contact the Dean of Students office, right, or counseling and mental health services, or, whatever the case may be. You might do this also, like if you've had a similar experience to someone else, and you met people, or you got involved with a group, or you found like an online support group or something like that, you may direct a person who's going through something similar to what you went through to those additional resources. So network support is essentially relying on the network to support the other person. So you'll notice that some forms of support focus on making people feel better and others focus on solving problems. And of course, we can use multiple types of supportive communication in a variety of relationships and interactions. Now, an interesting consideration, I think one of the more interesting considerations regarding supportive communication is that there actually is a dark side to support, right? And in examining the dark side, it's important to keep in mind the question, how can you provide the most helpful support to someone who is distressed? Because in some cases, supportive communication can actually backfire or make a situation worse than it already is. So this is something to be mindful of. So supportive communication can, first of all, threaten the receiver's positive or negative face. So the person in need of support, if their face is threatened, then that can be a problem, right? Because people want to communicate an identity that is both positive and autonomous or independent, right? So when support comes off as pity, or it suggests that the receiver is incapable of handling their own problems, it can make that person feel even worse. And this is especially true for information support, right? People tend to react negatively to advice that is unsolicited or pushy. So advice is really only effective if it does not threaten the receiver's face. So that's something to be mindful of. Supportive communication can also, unfortunately, result in really bad advice. Sometimes we want to spare the other person's feelings rather than telling them the truth. So we give them bad advice just because we're trying to be nice or we're trying to soothe the situation or make them feel better. Um, and then also, support givers often feel obligated to provide support even if they don't have the proper knowledge to do so. Um, a few years ago, there were these commercials circulating on TV. And I know you all don't watch much like live TV, you watch a lot of streaming TV, but in any event, these commercials often featured like two adults talking, and in one of the adults had a child who was doing drugs. And so that person disclosed to the friend um, that the child was doing drugs. And the response from the other person was things like, oh, I'm sure it's just a phase. If you gave that advice to somebody in real life, they may not seek help for that child, right? For that other person. So again, that's not good advice. That's bad advice. So supportive communication can threaten the receiver's positive or negative face. It can result in negative or bad advice, and it can also make the receiver feel judged or criticized, right? When you need support, you're vulnerable. You're in a vulnerable state. So you may have to admit something or reveal a negative or embarrassing quality or behavior that you engaged in. And so that kind of inherently encompasses or underscores the interaction there, the support seeker and the support giver's interaction and perhaps their relationship with one another. Supportive communication can also burden the support giver, right? Giving support, being there for another person is really difficult, which is why, there are only probably a few people in your life that you turn to in times of distress when you really need that support. Um, but there's concern from, in terms of the support giver, they may be concerned about giving the right advice, right? That can be very stressful to worry about. Am I offering the right advice in this situation? I'm not really sure. And also, if you give good advice or you provide really useful support, that person may continue to come back to you, right? So now you're engaging in this kind of cycle of support giving, which increases the emotional labor of that relationship substantially. So that's also something to consider. Um, so what's the solution then to this situation? Well, the solution, according to many interpersonal scholars, is invisible support. So invisible support are attempts to provide assistance or support to the receiver that sort of go unnoticed by the receiver. But they may be the most effective at reducing stress and promoting good health, right? So this is a situation where this receiver is either unaware of the action or they're aware of the action, but they don't perceive the act as being supportive. So maybe you make your roommate dinner after you know that they've had a stressful day, right? So your roommate comes home and you've prepared dinner, but you're not saying like, oh, you know what, you had a bad day, so I thought I'd make dinner. Instead, you just do it, and they're just sort of appreciative when they get home that they don't have to worry about that. Um, so the reason invisible support is effective is, again, people want to be perceived as autonomous and capable, not dependent or needy. And also, receiving too much support or support from an unskilled partner may call attention to your problems, which makes things worse and can lower self-esteem. So invisible support is sort of the compromise, if you will, and it's a better way of making sure the other person receives what they need without threatening their face. Much of the research on supportive communication has focused on something called person-centered messages. So person-centered messages tend to be high in responsiveness, and they communicate high quality support toward the other person. So person-centered messages acknowledge and elaborate and validate the receiver's feelings and concerns. And researchers have sort of identified three different levels of person-centered messages, or they've examined messages in terms of their person-centeredness. So, a highly person centered message conveys understanding and empathy. It helps the receiver think of the situation in a different way, and it gives the opportunity for the receiver to elaborate on their feelings. Right? So, it legitimizes their feelings and it helps them put those feelings in perspective. So, let's say that your friend loses a job and you say something to the effect of, I'm so sorry to hear that, and it must be so hard for you, but you're smart and you're strong, and maybe this is a new opportunity for you. Do you have any ideas or plans moving forward? Right? So, in that case, you are allowing them to engage in a conversation, right? To talk through their feelings. You're allowing them to disclose, but you're also asking questions. I mean, you have to sort of be careful here. You don't want to be too intrusive. But allowing them to open up and to kind of work through the situation is considered to be more effective than, a moderately person-centered message or a very low person-centered message. So a moderate person-centered message provides explanations or solutions, but does not really provide an opportunity for the receiver to contextualize or to elaborate on their feelings. So you might say something like, oh, everything will be okay. You're smart and you're strong, and I know you'll figure it out. And that's a very nice message. It's a very positive message, but it doesn't really leave much room for discussion or conversation, right? It feels a little hollow. Um, and I'm sure you've been in situations where you're like, well, that person was really nice, but I still feel like I need to work through this. I still feel like I need to talk this out. And then a message that's low in person centeredness um, either implicitly or explicitly denies the legitimacy of the receiver's feelings, right? So maybe you change the topic um, or the focus of the conversation, or you blame the receiver for the situation they're in and their distress. So you might say something like, in terms of like changing the topic, well, let's just go have a drink and get your mind off of it, right? You're not allowing them the space to have a conversation about how they're feeling. Or maybe you say something like, gee, that's really tough that you lost your job, but that company has been on the decline for years, right? So it's good that you're getting out of there. Or you say something like, well, that's a really tough situation and I'm sorry you lost your job, but you're always late to work and you complain about working there all the time, so it's really no surprise they're probably just sick of your attitude. So those may all be true statements, but that's not a very supportive message when someone is in a time of distress. So um, that kind of concludes our discussion on communicating closeness to other people. So again, there are three ways to do so: through affection, through immediacy, and through supportive communication. This was a crash course on all of those. There is a lot of research regarding each of these different types of behaviors. If you are interested, I am more than happy to send some of that your way or connect you to some of the people in our department who are doing that research. Dr. Amanda Dennis, for example, has done research on supportive communication along with her colleague, Dr. John Crowley, who I believe is at the University of Delaware. But again, if you're interested, reach out, let me know, and I'm happy to provide some additional information. Otherwise, stay tuned for our conversation about love and attachment.